The highway lay silent beneath a heavy grey sky, the kind of stillness that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel borrowed. Cars were stalled in a long, restless line, engines ticking over in the cold morning air. But no one dared to move. Somewhere ahead, something had stopped them, something no one could have expected. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, her eyes flicking from the rearview mirror to the dark mass just beyond the bend in the road. She could hear a faint rustling, the low murmur of a crowd that wasn't human, and it sent a shiver crawling down her spine. The highway wasn't just blocked, it was swallowed whole by shadows that shifted and moved with an eerie fluidity. Her breath fogged up the windshield as she exhaled slowly, trying to steady the panic that threatened to rise in her throat. The radio crackled with static, the DJ's voice struggling to cut through the interference, offering nothing but vague reports of a wildlife incident. But Sarah knew this was no ordinary traffic jam. There was something primal out there, something that had frozen time itself. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches lining the highway, carrying with it an unsettling silence that felt like the calm before a storm. She glanced over at her son in the back seat, his small face pressed against the window, wide-eyed and silent. He didn't understand why they weren't moving, why the world had suddenly stopped spinning on this stretch of asphalt, and Sarah wasn't sure she did either. Her phone buzzed with messages, friends checking in, news alerts popping up with blurry images she couldn't make sense of, but the screen's glow was cold comfort in the growing shadow that seemed to loom just beyond her car's headlights. Something was out there, gathered in numbers too large to count, and it wasn't just a crowd of animals. The tension in the air thickened, wrapping tight around the stalled vehicles like an invisible net. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as a low, haunting howl echoed down the highway, a sound that was both terrifying and mournful. And in that moment, she knew that whatever had brought this strange assembly here wasn't about to leave quietly or easily. The stillness inside Sarah's car was a fragile bubble, teetering on the edge of collapse. Her son, Jamie, shifted restlessly in the back seat, the soft rustle of his jacket the only sound besides the distant murmurs outside. He was 7, with a mop of unruly chestnut hair that always seemed to catch stray rays of sun on better days, days when the world moved faster, when the highway was just a road and not a stage for something unexplainable. Today, his small fingers traced the condensation on the window, leaving fleeting trails that blurred the shadows beyond. Sarah's eyes returned to the road ahead, where the vague shapes of those creatures remained, unmoving yet strangely alive. She tried to remember the last time they'd been truly free, before the demands of her job, before the divorce, before the endless balancing act of single motherhood. The highway stretched endlessly, a ribbon cutting through the winter-bare landscape of northern Oregon, where the trees stood like silent sentinels beneath a sky bruised with heavy clouds. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, a scent she usually found comforting, but now it only deepened the sense of unease. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she ignored it. The messages, the news alerts, they all felt distant, irrelevant to the immediate weight pressing down on her chest. Instead, she focused on Jamie's face, illuminated dimly by the fading light, his brows furrowed in quiet confusion. "Mom," his voice was tentative, breaking the silence like a fragile twig snapping. "Why aren't we moving? Are the wolves going to hurt us?" Sarah swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. She wanted to comfort him with a lie, to say it was just a delay, a broken-down truck, anything but the truth. But what was the truth? That hundreds of wolves, silent and watchful, had gathered like a living wall, holding them captive in this frozen moment. That the world outside had shifted into something primal, something older than fear itself. Instead, she said, "I don't know, Jamie. We just have to stay calm and wait. I promise I'm here." Her voice wavered, betraying the steady image she tried to project. Jamie nodded slowly, pressing his cheek against the glass, eyes wide and searching. Sarah could see the flicker of a question forming, a hope that things might return to normal, that the shadows would dissolve and the road would open again. But even as she watched, she knew the hope was fragile as the thin line keeping her own panic at bay. The car's heater hummed softly, a faint barrier against the chill seeping through the windows. Sarah rubbed her hands together, feeling the dry heat of the plastic steering wheel beneath her palms. The coldness outside seemed to seep into her bones, matching the creeping coldness in her thoughts. She thought of her father, a man of quiet strength who had taught her to read the wilderness, to respect its rhythms and dangers. He had always said the forest was a place of stories, some told in light, others whispered in shadow. Today, Sarah felt those shadows press in close, their stories tangled in the howls that still echoed faintly across the frozen landscape. Her mind drifted back to the morning's hurried rush, the spilled coffee on her shirt, Jamie's forgotten lunchbox, the mounting emails she hadn't answered, all the small fractures of daily life that now seemed insignificant against the vast unknown pressing against her windshield. The highway was no longer just a conduit between places, it was a liminal space, caught between the familiar and the uncanny. As time stretched, the quiet tension in the car thickened like a living thing. Sarah noticed the subtle shift in Jamie's breathing, the way he clutched his small stuffed wolf toy, a gift from a friend who had hoped to soothe his fear of animals. Now, the toy seemed both a comfort and a cruel irony. Sarah's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles whitening again, her gaze flicking to the rearview mirror where the line of cars stretched endlessly, a chain of shared uncertainty. Outside, the wolves' presence was at once intimate and vast. Their eyes, glinting faintly in the dim light, held a mixture of curiosity and something almost mournful. Sarah found herself wondering about their story, about what had driven this pack to gather here, blocking the highway like a living barricade. Was it hunger, fear, a call to something beyond human understanding? She felt a prickling at the back of her neck, a whisper of unease that wasn't just about the wolves. It was about the silence between them, the unspoken fears, the questions without answers, the fragile threads holding their small family together. The divorce had left its mark on Sarah and Jamie, subtle yet persistent. There were conversations left unfinished, emotions carefully boxed away to protect one another. Now, trapped in this frozen moment, those invisible walls felt thinner, more vulnerable. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, catching Jamie's eyes in the rearview mirror. He gave a small, uncertain smile, as if searching for reassurance in the storm of silence. She returned it, though inside, a knot of anxiety tightened. The hours ahead promised no easy answers, only the slow unraveling of what they thought they knew, and the quiet awakening of something new and deeply unsettling. The car's interior felt smaller now, the thin walls seeming to close in as the hours stretched on. Sarah caught herself glancing repeatedly at the rearview mirror, not just to check the line of cars behind, but searching for something she couldn't name. Each flicker of movement outside sent her pulse racing, even when it was nothing more than a shadow shifting between trees. Jamie's quietness was unsettling. The initial restlessness had settled into an eerie stillness that felt less like calm and more like a quiet waiting for something inevitable. She noticed how Jamie's fingers, once so busy tracing patterns on the glass, now gripped the wolf toy with a tension that made her stomach twist. There was a new hardness in his eyes, a distant look that seemed too old for a child. Sarah tried to meet his gaze, to find reassurance there, but the boy she saw was caught somewhere between fear and something else, something harder to read. It was the look of someone trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense, and it unsettled her more than the wolves outside. The heater's hum provided a dull comfort, yet the cold seemed to seep through anyway, layering over her skin like a second chill. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel, the plastic growing slick beneath her palms. She could feel the tension coiling inside her chest, a tight, restless energy that refused to release. Her mind flickered to a fragment of a conversation from weeks ago, something Jamie had said in passing, words about things that don't belong and why the shadows look wrong. She hadn't understood then, but now those odd phrases echoed loudly in her mind, unsettling and out of place. Was Jamie sensing something she couldn't? Or was the pressure of this moment twisting his young mind in ways she couldn't yet grasp? Outside, the pack remained still, a living wall of fur and glowing eyes, but something had changed. Sarah caught a glimpse of a low movement, an almost imperceptible ripple that passed through the cluster of wolves, like a silent signal. Her breath hitched as she tried to pinpoint the source. but the dim light in the distance played tricks on her senses. It was as if the wolves were no longer just watching, but communicating. An eerie, wordless conversation that left her feeling more isolated than ever. Jamie shifted beside her, breaking the silence with a whisper that seemed too soft to hear. "Mum, do you think they're waiting for something?" The question hung in the air, fragile, but heavy with meaning. Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to answer or let the silence swallow the thought. Instead, she nodded slowly, the movement more instinctive than certain. "Maybe," she said, voice barely above a breath. "Maybe they are." Her gaze drifted back to the shadows, searching for clues in the flickering shapes. The wolves' behavior was unlike anything she had ever seen. No signs of aggression, no frantic pacing or growling. Instead, there was a stillness, yes, but also a watchfulness that felt almost expectant. Sarah felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself before, a creeping doubt about what this gathering truly meant. Was this simply a blockade, or something more deliberate? Something that had a purpose beyond human understanding? The sky darkened further, clouds thickening into a heavy, oppressive blanket. The fading light caught on the wet asphalt, reflecting the glint of eyes in the distance. Sarah's mind raced, looking for explanations, for any thread she could pull to unravel the knot tightening in her chest. But the more she searched, the more questions multiplied. The familiar rhythms of the world had fractured into an unrecognizable pattern, each heartbeat a reminder of the fragile boundary between the known and the unknown. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement outside, a flicker of motion at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, heart pounding, but saw only a dark figure retreating behind a tree. It was human, she was almost certain. A person, not a wolf, but who? And why here, in the middle of this strange, frozen tableau? Sarah's mind reeled with possibilities, none comforting or threatening. The thought that they might not be alone out here, that others shared this strange, silent prison, added a new layer of tension. Jamie's voice broke through again, quieter this time, almost hesitant. "Do you think they can see us?" His eyes searched hers, wide and vulnerable. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his question settle like a stone in her throat. She wanted to say no to reassure him that they were hidden behind glass and metal and distance, but the truth was murky, tangled in the shifting shadows beyond. "I don't know," she admitted softly, the words tasting like fear. "But we have to be ready, just in case." A silence fell between them, thick and almost suffocating. Sarah's gaze lingered on the wolf toy clenched tightly in Jamie's hand, the small symbol of comfort now a fragile barrier against the growing unknown. Outside, and the wolves remained, a silent audience to the unfolding story, their eyes reflecting secrets Sarah was only beginning to glimpse. The highway wasn't just blocked, it was a threshold, and whatever lay beyond it was waiting. The quiet hum of the heater was suddenly pierced by a sharp, distant sound, a crack like the snap of a branch underfoot. Sarah's head snapped toward the window, heart jolting. Outside, and the wolves remained still, but a new tension pulsed beneath their calm, as if the animals themselves sensed a shift in the air. Her breath hitched, and she felt Jamie stiffen beside her. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, eyes scanning the thin strip of forest visible beyond the highway guardrails. Shadows pressed close, but now they seemed to flicker with movement that didn't belong to the wolves. Something was out there, something human. Before Sarah could gather her thoughts, a figure emerged slowly from between the trees. A man, his clothes dark and blending with the underbrush, his face obscured by the low brim of a worn cap. He moved cautiously, hands raised slightly in a non-threatening gesture, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the line of cars like a man searching for a way through. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she was sure the man could hear it. Jamie clutched her arm, his small fingers digging in with an urgency she hadn't felt before. "Mom, who is that?" "I don't know," Sarah said, voice trembling but steady. She unlocked the car doors with a click, the sound sharp in the stillness. "Stay back, Jamie," she warned softly, eyes fixed on the stranger. The man approached slowly, stopping just beyond the shoulder of the highway. His voice was low but carried easily in the cold air. "Are you all right in there? I'm sorry if I scared you. I'm a wildlife researcher." part of a team monitoring the wolf packs in this region. Sarah blinked, the word researcher cutting through the fog of fear like a sudden shaft of light. Researcher, he nodded, ping closer. We've been tracking these wolves for months. This isn't normal behavior for them. They don't usually gather in such large numbers or block a major road like this. His eyes flicked toward the dark shapes beyond the highway, the glint of dozens of eyes watching silently from the trees. Why now? Why here? Sarah asked, desperation seeping into her voice. The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the pack before meeting her gaze again. Something's changed in their environment. There's been increased logging nearby, disruptions to their hunting grounds. The wolves are stressed, disoriented. This gathering might be a response to those pressures, but there's more. We've detected signs of illness, something contagious spreading through the pack. Sarah's breath caught. Illness? Like what? He shook his head. We're still analyzing samples, but it's viral, highly contagious among canines, and it's causing aggressive, erratic behavior in some. That's why the pack is acting as one, blocking the highway. They're confused, scared, and protecting their territory more fiercely than usual. Jamie's eyes widened, the fear in his small voice unmistakable. Do you think they'll attack us? The researcher's gaze softened. Wolves usually avoid humans, but when they're sick and stressed, their behavior can be unpredictable. It's best to stay inside your car and remain quiet until we can safely manage the situation. Sarah exhaled slowly, the knot in her chest tightening anew. The wolves weren't just a mysterious blockade, they were victims themselves, driven to desperation by human interference and disease. The realization hit her like a wave. This was no mere animal incident. It was a reflection of deeper, unresolved conflicts between nature and civilization. Suddenly, a crackle came from the researcher's radio clipped to his jacket. His expression shifted from calm to alarmed as he listened intently. There's more. Our team found evidence of traps and snares set near the forest edge, illegal poaching activity. Someone's been trying to capture or kill the wolves, and the pack's response is escalating. Sarah felt her skin prickle. Poachers? Here? Why would anyone do that now? Fear, greed, ignorance, it's complicated. But what's clear is that the pack is cornered, their usual patterns shattered. That's why they've blocked the highway, creating a protective barrier against what they perceive as threats. The man's words settled over Sarah like a cold weight. The peaceful animals she had once admired, the creatures Jamie's wolf toy symbolized, were caught in a brutal struggle for survival. The wolves weren't just blocking the road, they were sending a desperate signal, one born from pain and confusion. Jamie's voice was small but steady. Mom, can we help them? Sarah looked down at her son, his face illuminated by the dim dashboard light, determination flickering in his eyes. She swallowed hard, the protective instinct warring with the helplessness that gnawed at her. I don't know, Jamie, but maybe understanding what's happening is the first. The researcher nodded, his gaze distant. We're coordinating with wildlife officials to contain the situation. It won't be quick or easy, but the wolves need space to recover, and people need to respect their boundaries. Outside, the pack shifted, as if in response to the new presence. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, not aimed at Sarah's car but resonating with the chaos of their fractured world. The wolves were no longer just silent watchers. They were active participants in a crisis that blurred the lines between predator and victim. Sarah's mind raced with the implications. This blockade was not a random act of nature. It was a symptom of a larger, more painful story. The highway was a crossroads in more ways than one, a place where human impact collided with the wild in raw, unfiltered ways. Her gaze met Jamie's once more. The fear in his eyes had shifted, replaced by a quiet resolve that mirrored her own. They were trapped between worlds, caught in a moment that demanded more than patience. It demanded awareness, empathy, action. As the sky darkened further, the weight of the revelations settled deep within Sarah's bones. This was no longer just about waiting for the wolves to move on. It was about recognizing the fragile balance they all depended on, and the consequences of tipping that balance too far. The highway remained blocked, but now it was clear. The road ahead wouldn't simply reopen, It would demand reckoning. And Sarah, Jamie, and everyone trapped in this frozen tableau were witnesses to a story far larger than themselves, a story of survival, loss, and the urgent need for change. Outside, the eyes of the pack glinted with a raw intelligence that felt both haunting and hopeful. The wolves were waiting, not just for the world to pass them by, but for it to listen. And for the first time, Sarah understood that waiting was no longer enough. The weight of the researcher's words settled over Sarah like a dense fog, thickening the air in the cramped confines of her car. For a long moment, she said nothing, her breath shallow and uneven, as if the reality he'd unveiled had somehow tightened around her lungs. The familiar hum of the heater seemed distant now, swallowed by the stillness that pressed in from every side. Jamie's small hand remained locked around the wolf toy, but his grip had slackened, the tension in his knuckles fading into an uncertain tremor. Sarah's eyes drifted to the window, watching the wolves beyond with a new lens, no longer just as wild creatures, but as victims caught in a web of human destruction and disease. The revelation unraveled something inside her, a thread of helplessness twisting through the fear she'd been carrying since dawn. How had she missed it? The subtle signs, the unease that had gnawed at the edges of her mind all morning, now crystallized into a sorrow too vast for words. Her fingers absently traced the steering wheel's worn leather, the texture grounding her as the storm of emotions swirled within. She couldn't stop the images flooding back, the relentless logging trucks she'd seen on the highway last week, the fresh scars on the forest floor, the faint but unmistakable scent of smoke and machine oil lingering in the cold air. Each memory felt like a fresh wound, proof of wounds deeper than any she could see. Jamie's voice broke through the silence, soft and hesitant. "Mum, do you think the wolves know we're scared?" Sarah swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing. She wanted to offer reassurance, to shield him with the kind of certainty she no longer felt. Instead, she found herself whispering, "I don't know, honey, but maybe they can sense it." Her gaze flickered back to his face, illuminated by the dashboard's dim light, his wide eyes reflecting the same raw vulnerability she fought to hide. The car felt suddenly smaller, the space between them shrinking as the unspoken truths gathered like shadows at the edges of their fragile bubble. Sarah noticed the subtle tremor in Jamie's breath, the way his small frame curled inward, as if trying to protect himself from the invisible weight pressing down on them both. She reached back, her hand finding his, fingers closing gently around his wrist in a silent promise of safety they both desperately needed. But the promise felt fragile, almost hollow. How could she protect him from something so vast and unknowable? From the sickness spreading through a pack that had once symbolized freedom and wildness, from the poachers lurking like ghosts in the trees, threatening to shatter the fragile balance between human and nature. The questions spiraled, each one a whisper of doubt and despair. Sarah's mind flickered back to the divorce, the fracture lines in her own life, the delicate construction of routine and stability she'd painstakingly built for Jamie. All those small everyday battles now seemed trivial against the backdrop of this crisis. Yet, the fragility of her family's world suddenly felt connected to the fragility of the forest and its creatures. Both were caught in a liminal space, vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Her chest tightened with a mixture of grief and anger. Anger at the careless hands that had ravaged the forest, at the greed that had pushed the wolves to the brink, at the cruelty that had set traps for creatures only trying to survive. And grief, a slow, simmering ache for the loss of innocence, for the breaking of trust between human and wild. Jamie's voice, barely audible, stirred her from the spiral. "Mom, can we do something? Please." Her heart clenched at the sincerity in his tone, the fierce hope that flickered despite the fear. She hesitated, torn between the urge to protect and the need to acknowledge the truth. "I want to," she said quietly. "But right now, the best thing we can do is stay safe and listen. We have to understand what's happening before we can help." The researcher's presence lingered in the car like a shadow, his words echoing in the space between them. Sarah realized that this moment was a turning point, not just in the crisis unfolding outside, but inside herself. The woman who had set out on this journey that morning, burdened by everyday worries and the fractured pieces of her life, was no longer the same. Her eyes met Jamie's again, searching for the boy she knew beneath the weight of fear and confusion. She saw resilience there, a spark of quiet strength that mirrored her own, even as it trembled beneath uncertainty. For the first time in hours, a fragile thread of hope wove through the tension, a recognition that they were not alone in this, that their fear was shared, their vulnerability reciprocal. The stillness deepened, the fading light outside casting long shadows across the dashboard. The forest whispered beyond the glass, alive with secrets Sarah couldn't yet unravel. The wolves remained, a silent testament to a world unraveling at the seams, to stories of survival etched in fur and shadow. Sarah exhaled slowly, the breath trembling as it left her lips. She reached over, adjusting the radio to catch the faintest crackle of news. But the static was a reminder that clarity was still out of reach. For now, all they had was this suspended moment, a pause heavy with meaning, where the past and the future blurred into an uncertain present. Her gaze lingered on Jamie's face, the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyes flickered shut for a brief moment as exhaustion claimed him. She felt the fragile bond between them strengthen, a silent vow to face whatever came next together, even if the path was shrouded in shadow. And as the wolves watched from the darkness outside, Sarah understood that this waiting was a reckoning, a slow awakening to a truth that would not be forgotten. The road ahead was no longer just a highway through Oregon's winter woods. It was a threshold into something deeper, a crossing where fear, grief, and hope converged. Inside the car, the silence stretched, not empty, but full of questions, full of promises, full of the quiet strength born from facing the unknown side by side. The soft glow of the dashboard lights cast a muted halo over Sarah's face, illuminating the fine lines etched by sleepless nights and unspoken worries. Outside, the wolves lingered like living shadows, their presence a constant yet distant murmur against the cold stillness of the car's interior. But it was inside where the true storm raged, a tempest of thoughts and feelings, twisting and turning without mercy. Her hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, fingers tracing absent patterns along its worn leather. The texture was familiar, a small anchor amid the swirling tide of uncertainty. Yet even this comfort felt fragile, as if held together by threads too thin to bear the weight pressing down on her chest. The hours of waiting, the revelations from the researcher, the silent gazes of those wild eyes beyond the glass, all converged into an echo chamber inside her mind, amplifying doubts she hadn't dared face until now. A faint scent drifted in from the cracked window, the sharp bite of pine needles mixed with damp earth and something faintly metallic. It tugged at a memory she hadn't touched in years. A childhood afternoon spent wandering the woods with her father, his steady voice guiding her through the maze of trees, teaching her to listen to the land's unspoken stories. She could almost feel his rough hands steadying hers, the warmth of his presence a balm against the cold. But that warmth had faded long ago, replaced by absences and silences that stretched between them like chasms. Sarah's breath caught, and for a moment her eyes closed, as if shutting out the present could summon that past again. In the quiet darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the house where she grew up, the worn wooden essie, the creak of the porch swing, the scent of fresh pine needles carried in through the open window. She remembered the way her father's laughter had sounded, low and steady, a grounding force in a world that often felt unpredictable. But she also remembered the last time she'd seen him, the strained words left unspoken, the distance that had grown between them with each passing year. The ache of those memories pressed against her heart, mingling with the weight of the moment. She realized, with a pang of guilt, how much she'd carried on without truly reckoning with the ghosts of her past. The divorce, the endless balancing act of motherhood, the relentless push to keep going. All of it had become a way to avoid facing the deeper fractures within herself. Now, trapped in this frozen tableau with Jamie and the wolves, those fractures seemed to widen, threatening to swallow her whole. Her gaze drifted to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Jamie's small face reflected in the glass. His eyes were closed now, exhaustion softening the tension that had gripped him all day. The wolf toy lay forgotten on his lap, a silent witness to the turmoil that neither of them could fully understand. Sarah felt a swell of protectiveness mixed with a helplessness that clawed at her insides. How could she shield him from a world that was unraveling in ways she barely comprehended herself? A flicker of doubt surfaced, a quiet, insistent whisper questioning everything she thought she knew about strength and resilience. Was it enough to stay calm, to wait, to hope? Or was she merely postponing the inevitable reckoning? The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fear, not as a weakness, but as a raw, honest truth. The heater's soft hum filled the silence, a gentle reminder of the fragile warmth that still existed within this small sanctuary. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a folded photograph she hadn't seen in years. The edges were worn, the image faded, but the faces captured within were vivid in her mind, her parents, young and smiling beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, a moment frozen in time before the fractures took hold. She traced the outline of her mother's face with a trembling finger, then shifted to her father's steady gaze. The photo was a relic of a simpler time, a tether to a past that seemed both distant and achingly close. Holding it, Sarah felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Love and loss, guilt and gratitude, hope and despair, all tangled together in a messy, beautiful knot. The quiet weight of the moment settled over her like a shroud, pressing her to confront the parts of herself she had long buried. The woman who had faced the wolves outside now faced a new kind of wilderness within. The tangled thickets of memory and emotion, the shadows of regret, and the flickering light of possibility. She realized that this journey was not just about survival, but about reckoning with the stories that had shaped her, and the ones she still needed to tell. Time seemed to stretch and fold around her, the minutes blurring into a seamless thread of introspection. The world beyond the glass, the wolves, the forest, the frozen highway, receded into a backdrop for the quiet drama unfolding within. Sarah's breath slowed, her heartbeat settling into a rhythm that felt both fragile and steady, like the tentative first S toward healing. She imagined the wolves beyond the car, their eyes reflecting not just fear or aggression, but something deeper, a yearning for connection, a plea for understanding. It mirrored her own hidden desires, the unspoken hopes she carried for Jamie and herself. In that reflection, she found a flicker of something new, the possibility that even in the midst of chaos, there could be a path forward. The silence deepened, enveloping her like a soft blanket. No answers came, no resolutions offered themselves. Instead, there was only the quiet acceptance of complexity, the acknowledgement that fear and hope, grief and love could coexist within the same fragile space, that the road ahead might be uncertain, but it was theirs to navigate together. Sarah's eyes opened slowly, meeting Jamie's in the rearview mirror once more. His small smile, faint but real, was a beacon in the dim light. She returned it, a silent vow passing between them, to face whatever came next, not with certainty, but with courage born from the messy, beautiful truth of their shared humanity. Outside, the wolves remained still, their presence a haunting echo of the world's fragile balance. Inside, Sarah sat quietly, the photograph resting on the dashboard, a symbol of the past she carried and the future she was beginning to imagine. The waiting had changed her, not by providing answers, but by opening the door to a deeper understanding of herself, her son, and the wild, tangled story they were part of. In that stillness, beneath the heavy sky and the watchful eyes of the pack, Sarah felt the first stirrings of a new kind of strength, one born not from control, but from surrender, not from certainty, but from the willingness to embrace the unknown. And in that gentle, trembling moment, she knew she could not go back. The road ahead was different now, and so was she. The evening air shifted suddenly, a sharp gust rattling the car windows like a warning. Outside, the dark silhouettes of the wolves flickered against the thickening shadows of the forest, their eyes glinting in the dimming light. The sky, once heavy but still, now churned with restless clouds, threaded with streaks of deep indigo and bruised purple. The world seemed to hold its breath, teetering on the edge of something impossible to name. Inside the car, Sarah's fingers trembled as they clenched the steering wheel, knuckles pale beneath the harsh glow of the dashboard. Jamie stirred beside her, his small body taut, eyes wide and unblinking. The fragile stillness they had clung to all day was fracturing, splintering beneath the weight of uncertainty and the creeping fear that had begun to seep into every corner of their shared space. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence with a burst of static. Then a voice, urgent, clipped, unfamiliar. All units, be advised. The blockade on Highway 28 is escalating, reports of aggressive wolf behavior increasing. Civilians advised to remain in vehicles and await assistance. The words cut through the car like a blade, cold and uncompromising. Sarah's breath caught, and the steady mask she'd worn all day cracked. "They're getting worse," she whispered, voice breaking. "It's not just confusion anymore. They're scared, angry." Her eyes flicked to Jamie, searching for his reaction, but he only blinked, silent and still. Then from the trees came a sudden sharp yelp, a piercing sound that sliced through the gathering dusk. The wolves responded instantly, a ripple of movement passing through the pack like a live wire, their bodies tensed, ears shifting, muscles coiling beneath fur that bristled with unease. The air hummed with raw energy, thick and electric. Sarah's heart thundered as the first growl rolled low from the shadows, a guttural warning that vibrated through the very ground beneath their tires. Her body jerked forward, hands tightening on the wheel until her nails dug into the leather, white-hot pain blossoming beneath her fingertips. "Mum!" Jamie's voice was a tremor, barely a whisper. "What's happening? Are they going to attack?" She swallowed hard, the lump rising in her throat threatening to choke her words. "I don't know," she admitted, voice trembling, "but we have to stay calm. We can't let fear take over." Her attempt at reassurance felt hollow even to her own ears. Suddenly, a sharp rap at the passenger window made them both jump. Sarah spun her head to the side, heart leaping into her throat. Outside stood the researcher, the man who had appeared hours ago like a guardian from some other world, his face grim beneath the brim of his cap, eyes flicking nervously between the car and the dark forest beyond. "Sarah," he called in a low voice, urgency threading every syllable. "You need to move, now. The wolves, they're becoming unpredictable. We've spotted figures near the tree line. Poachers. They're agitated the pack even more." Her skin prickled, dread unfurling like a dark bloom in her chest. "Poachers. Here. Now." The words rushed out, disbelief sharpening her tone. "Yes. They're close. We don't know their numbers or intentions, but they're armed. This can't end well if we stay put." Jamie's small hand gripped hers suddenly, pulling sharply, eyes burning with a mix of fear and resolve. "Mom, we have to get out of here." "Please." Sarah's mind raced. The car felt suddenly claustrophobic, the metal cage a fragile barrier against the chaos closing in. She glanced back once more at the line of vehicles, faces pale and tense behind fogged windows, all trapped in this wilderness standoff. She thought about the researcher's warning, the poachers lurking just beyond the tree line, and the wolves, once majestic, now raw with fear and fury. Her chest tightened, a suffocating pressure mounting with a fierce urgency. "Okay," she whispered, voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "We're moving." The engine roared to life, a sudden, violent sound that shattered the uneasy quiet. Outside, the wolves stirred, a wave of growls and flashes of teeth rippling through the pack. Sarah felt the weight of their eyes, filled with confusion and betrayal, as if the very act of breaking free was a wound. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisting highway ahead, slick with frost, edged by towering pines that seemed to lean in, watching, waiting. The radio sputtered with fragments of voices, warnings, and scattered reports that only deepened the sense of urgency. As the car edged forward, Sarah's phone buzzed relentlessly on the passenger seat, a flood of messages, calls, and alerts from friends, news outlets, and unknown numbers. She ignored them all, focusing on the road, on Jamie's pale face beside her, on the tightening knot in her gut. A sudden movement at the edge of the forest caught her eye, a figure slipping between the trees, shadowed and swift. Her breath hitched, and her grip tightened. "Did you see that?" she asked. voice barely steady. Jamie nodded, eyes wide. They're coming closer. Panic surged, raw and unfiltered. Sarah's mind flashed to the researchers' words. Poachers, armed, dangerous. The wolves, already frayed by sickness and stress, now cornered by human threats. The fragile balance shattered. Stay calm, she repeated to herself, though the mantra felt like a brittle shield against the storm breaking loose. Her heart pounded in her ears, a frantic drumbeat echoing the chaos outside. The growls grew louder, closer. A chorus of wilderness warning and human desperation tangled into one. The car's windows vibrated under the weight of the unseen tension, the space inside shrinking as fear clawed its way into every breath. Suddenly, Jamie's hand shot up, pressing against the glass, eyes wide and frantic. "Mom, they're trying to get in!" Sarah turned sharply, heart leaping. At the passenger window, a shadow moved, then another. Figures pushing against the glass, faces obscured by scarves and hats, hands gripping makeshift weapons. The reality slammed into her with brutal force. The poachers were here, and nothing about this was safe anymore. Her voice cracked as she shouted, "Stay back, don't come any closer!" But the words were swallowed by the night, lost in the tension thickening the air. Jamie whimpered, curling into her side as the car rocked with the sudden impact of a heavy blow against the door. Sarah's body tensed, instincts screaming to protect, to fight, to run. But the road behind them was a frozen line of stalled cars and frightened faces. The highway a trap caught between wild fury and human menace. The wolves howled, a mournful, chaotic symphony that rose over the crackling radio static. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a cry of loss, confusion, and defiance. And as the world outside the car spiraled toward chaos, Sarah realized with a sinking certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The fragile bubble they'd lived in all day had shattered. The waiting was over. Now came the reckoning. The sudden pounding against the passenger window reverberated through the car, shattering the fragile calm Sarah had clung to all day. But beneath the raw panic, a deeper, more subtle tremor began stirring within her. A whisper of recognition, a thread unraveling from the tangled web of the day's events. As the shadows pressed closer outside, something inside Sarah shifted, drawing her mind back to a moment she had buried beneath layers of exhaustion and fear. Hours earlier, when Jamie had quietly murmured about things that don't belong and why the shadows look wrong, she had brushed it aside as the fanciful fears of a child caught in a strange, unsettling moment. But now, with the poachers closing in and the wolves' growls rising like a storm, those words echoed with a new, haunting clarity. Jamie had seen more than she realized, had sensed an undercurrent, a hidden tension threading through the forest and their predicament. And she, a woman schooled in the wilderness by her father's steady hand, had missed the signs. Her gaze flicked to the wolf toy clenched in Jamie's trembling fingers, a small talisman that had transformed from comfort to symbol. It wasn't just a child's plaything. It was a reminder of stories told in shadows and whispers, stories her father had shared in the woods when she was young. Tales of packs not merely surviving, but communicating in ways humans often overlooked, of a fragile balance between respect and intrusion. And now, that balance was teetering on the edge of collapse. Sarah's mind raced back to an old, faded photograph resting on her dashboard, the one she'd pulled from the glove compartment just before the sky darkened. It was a picture of her parents, standing beneath golden autumn leaves, faces etched with both warmth and the unspoken weight of their own fractures. She remembered her father's quiet warnings about the forest's fragility, about how human hands could wound deeper than any animal's claws. He had spoken of poachers, not just as threats to wildlife, but as manifestations of something darker, a disregard born of fear and greed. The realization slammed into her with a sudden brutal force. The poachers lurking at the forest's edge were not random outsiders. They were part of a cycle she'd only glimpsed in fragments, a cycle she had, perhaps unknowingly, been complicit in. The logging truck she had seen on the highway last week, the scars etched across the forest floor, these were not isolated acts, but threads woven into a larger pattern of destruction. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between those events, her own life had intersected with the wolves' fate. She recalled a phone call from weeks before, one she had dismissed in the rush of everyday chaos, a message from a local conservation group seeking volunteers to monitor wolf populations, a plea to help protect what's left. She had told herself there wasn't time, that Jamie needed stability more than she needed to fight battles she couldn't win. But now, trapped in this standoff, the weight of that decision pressed down like a stone. Her breath hitched as she thought of the researcher, the man who had appeared from the shadows like a guardian angel, yet whose presence now seemed tinged with ambiguity. His calm explanations, the warnings about illness and poachers, the urgency in his voice, they were pieces of a puzzle she hadn't fully seen. Had he been solely a rescuer? Or was he also a witness to something more complicated? Someone caught between the wild and the human, bearing burdens neither side fully understood. Sarah's heart clenched at the thought that the researcher might be both ally and enigma, a figure embodying the tangled loyalties and blurred lines that defined this crisis. She remembered how he had paused before mentioning the traps, his eyes darkening with unspoken concern. Was there more to his story? A hidden connection to the wolves, to the poachers, to the very balance hanging by a thread? Jamie's small voice broke through the swirl of thoughts, fragile yet insistent. "Mom, do you think they know we're scared?" His eyes searched hers, wide and vulnerable, mirroring the raw uncertainty she felt within. Sarah swallowed the lump rising in her throat, forcing herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Maybe," she admitted softly. "But maybe they also feel scared too. Maybe we're not so different after all." The words hung between them, a fragile bridge spanning the divide between human and wild, fear and understanding. In that moment, Sarah recognized the depth of their shared entrapment, not just in the stalled cars and the looming threat outside, but in the unraveling of their own inner worlds. The divorce, the fractured family, the unspoken regrets, all mirrored the wolves' own struggle for survival amid forces beyond their control. A sudden flicker of movement at the edge of her vision pulled her attention back outside. The wolves shifted, their eyes reflecting a mixture of wariness and something almost mournful. She thought of Jamie's earlier question about whether the wolves were waiting for something. Now she understood. They were waiting for recognition, for the world to see them not as monsters or obstacles, but as fragile beings caught in a storm of human recklessness and natural impulse. Yet the poachers' presence complicated everything. Their shadowed figures, pressing in with weapons and intentions unknown, turned the wolves from silent watchers into desperate defenders. The highway was no longer just a physical blockade. It was a battleground where survival, morality, and the consequences of choices long ignored collided. Sarah felt the weight of this realization deepen her own entrapment. She was no longer just a bystander or a frightened mother. She was a participant in a story woven with past decisions and hidden connections, a story where the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred. The wolf's plight mirrored her own fractured life, both caught in cycles of fear, loss, and the desperate hope for redemption. Her hand tightened around Jamie's, the small warmth grounding her amid the chaos. She knew the coming hours would demand more than endurance. They would require courage to confront uncomfortable truths, to question who could be trusted, and to face the shadows lurking not just outside, but within. As the growls outside swelled into a chorus of wild defiance, Sarah's mind settled on a single, unshakable thought. The waiting was over. This was no longer a pause between moments. It was a reckoning of all the unseen threads pulling at the fragile fabric of their world. And in that reckoning, she understood something vital. The wolves were not just blocked on the highway. They were a mirror held up to humanity's fractured soul. And she, Sarah, was looking into that mirror, forced to reckon with the reflection staring back. The car sat motionless on the slick highway, its engine idling like a heartbeat in a body too exhausted to move. Outside, the wolves' eyes glimmered through the gathering darkness, unnerving, patient, unyielding. Inside, Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts, each one a reminder of the fragile barrier between her and the wild unknown pressing against the glass. The world beyond the windshield felt both immense and claustrophobic, as if the night itself had folded around her, squeezing tight. The radio's crackle was a thin thread of noise in the thick silence, but even that faltered, fading into static that whispered of distance and disconnection. Sarah's fingers trembled on the steering wheel, the worn leather slick with cold sweat. She tried to steady herself, inhaling the faint scent of pine that drifted through the slightly cracked window, a scent that now seemed less comforting and more like a ghost, a memory slipping away. Jamie sat beside her, curled inward, his small form almost swallowed by the car seat. His eyes were closed, but Sarah could feel the tension vibrating beneath his skin, the ragged rise and fall of his breath betraying the calm he pretended to wear. The wolf toy lay abandoned on the floor, forgotten in a moment too heavy for play. Sarah's mind raced, but the thoughts came in fragments, snatches of conversation, memories she wished she could rewrite, moments of doubt and anger that churned like a storm beneath her ribs. The researcher's words echoed relentlessly: illness, poachers, destruction, each one a shard piercing the fragile illusion that this was just a strange, isolated incident. No. This was something much deeper, a wound that cut through the tangled relationship between humans and the wild. Her gaze drifted to the rearview mirror, catching Jamie's reflection, his face pale, eyes sunken but determined. For a moment, their eyes met, a silent exchange passing between them. He was holding on to something, some flicker of hope or resolve that Sarah wasn't sure she could match. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat and looked away, unable to meet his gaze any longer. The night pressed in, thick and suffocating. Outside, the wolves shifted closer, their growls low rumbles vibrating through the ground beneath the tires. The forest seemed to lean in, the tall pines bending like silent sentinels watching a fragile altar of fear and desperation. Somewhere beyond the trees, shadows moved, figures that didn't belong to the wild carrying the weight of human menace and greed. Sarah's hands tightened, knuckles whitening as the cold seeped into her bones. The car, once a sanctuary, felt like a fragile cage, walls closing in with every passing minute. She reached for her phone, the screen lighting up with a flood of messages, pleas for news, warnings, updates from a world that seemed both distant and unbearably close. She ignored them all, the buzzing a sharp irritation against the stillness. Her thoughts spiraled back to the photograph on the dashboard, the faded image of her parents beneath autumn leaves, faces frozen in a moment of warmth that now felt impossibly distant. She traced the edges with a trembling finger, feeling the weight of past fractures, the silent losses that had shaped her. The divorce, the empty spaces in her life, the unspoken regrets that clawed quietly beneath the surface. All of it converging here, in this frozen moment on a quiet highway swallowed by shadows. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a sharp rap at the driver's window. Sarah jolted, heart pounding fiercely. She turned to see the researcher's face, pale and drawn, eyes darkened by exhaustion and something else. Maybe fear, maybe resignation. He spoke in a low whisper, his words heavy with urgency. "We don't have much time. The poachers are moving in. The wolves, they're scared, angry. This is going to get worse before it gets better." Sarah's throat tightened. "What can we do?" He shook his head. "Right now, wait. Stay inside. But you need to understand, this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about what we're willing to lose or sacrifice." The car seemed to contract around her, the weight of his words pressing down like a physical force. Sarah looked back at Jamie, who was now staring at the window, eyes wide and unblinking, as if trying to see beyond the glass into a future neither of them could yet grasp. Her voice was barely audible. "I don't know if I can do this." Jamie's small hand found hers, gripping tightly. "You can. We have to." The determination in his voice was a fragile lifeline, but Sarah felt something inside her fracture, a fissure she could no longer ignore. She realized that the line she had held onto for so long, the line between hope and despair, action and paralysis, safety and danger, had already been crossed. The waiting was over. The moment of choice was here. Her eyes swept the frozen landscape outside, the silent wolves, the whispering trees, the encroaching shadows of men who brought destruction wrapped in silence. The highway was no longer a road. It was a threshold between what had been and what must come next, a place where innocence died and raw truth was born. Sarah's breath hitched as a tear slipped down her cheek, cold and sharp against her skin. She wiped it away quickly, ashamed of the vulnerability but unable to stop the tremor shaking through her. This was no longer about protecting Jamie from the world. It was about facing the world, no matter how broken, no matter how terrifying. She reached over and turned the radio dial, seeking some flicker of connection amidst the static. A fragmented news report whispered of evacuation plans, law enforcement mobilizing, but it felt distant, detached from the raw immediacy pressing into the car like a living thing. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Sarah whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "We can't go back." Jamie's voice was a fragile echo. "No, we can't." The wolves howled, a haunting sound that seemed to carry both warning and sorrow. It was a lament for all that had been lost, and a call to what must be faced. The night deepened, swallowing the highway in shadows and uncertainty. Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of everything collapsing inward. She was no longer the woman who had sat in this car at dawn, hoping for a simple delay, a chance to pass through. She was someone changed, stripped bare by fear, grief, and a dawning resolve. The road ahead was uncharted and unforgiving, but there was no turning back. The reckoning had begun. The weight of the moment settled over Sarah like a suffocating shroud, thick and unyielding. The wolves' growls outside had deepened into a low, unrelenting rumble, vibrating through the car's frame and into her bones. Jamie's grip on her hand tightened, his small fingers trembling with a mix of fear and fierce determination. The night pressed in from all sides, the highway now a narrow corridor between two worlds, one wild and desperate, the other human and dangerous. Sarah's breath hitched, her mind racing through a whirlwind of memories and fears. The fractures in her life mirrored the fractures in this frozen standoff. The divorce that left her raw and searching, the fractured bond with her father's wilderness wisdom, the silent regrets she'd carried like stones in her pocket. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the swirling dread, something else stirred, a raw ember of resolve that refused to be snuffed out. She glanced over at Jamie, his wide eyes locked on hers, silently begging for guidance. "Mum," he whispered, voice trembling but steady, "we can't just wait here, we have to do something." Her heart pounded fiercely, the impulse to protect warring with the knowledge of the danger beyond the glass. But Sarah knew he was right. Waiting had stretched into paralysis, and the wolves' mounting agitation, coupled with the looming threat of poachers, meant the fragile balance was tipping toward chaos. "I know," she said quietly, her voice firmer than she felt. "But we can't just rush blindly. We have to be smart, careful." Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching the endless line of trapped cars behind them. "There are others counting on us too." Her mind settled on the researcher's words, the warnings about the sickness spreading through the pack, the illegal traps, the poachers closing in. All signs pointed to a crisis not just of survival, but of understanding and respect. If she was going to act, it had to be with purpose. Sarah reached for her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed the emergency wildlife hotline number she'd saved days ago on a whim. A small act of hope she'd almost forgotten. The line rang, static, crackling beneath the calm, professional voice that answered. She spoke quickly, urgently, relaying their location, the presence of poachers, and the wolves' escalating distress. As she hung up, the car's interior felt charged, the air electric with a sense of crossing a threshold. This was no longer a passive moment of waiting. It was the ignition of action, uncertain, risky, but necessary. Jamie leaned close, voice barely a breath. "What now?" Sarah met his gaze, searching for courage in the depths of his young eyes and finding her own reflected back. "Now," she said, "we become part of the story. We have to help stop this, help the wolves in the forest before it's too late." Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath, shadows shifting as if in response. The growls softened just slightly, a fragile truce hanging in the air. But Sarah knew it was fleeting. The poachers were still out there, the sickness still spreading, and the pack's patience thinning. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the conservation group's contact list, and a map of the area marked with safe zones and patrol routes. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases as if steadying herself. This small map, once just a forgotten scrap, was now a lifeline. a symbol of choice, of agency reclaimed. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke to Jamie and the researcher, who had reappeared at the window, his expression grave but resolute. "We're moving forward," she declared. "No more waiting. We face this with eyes open, hearts ready. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The headlights of the stalled cars behind flickered like distant stars, faint beacons of shared fate. The forest beyond the wolves' watchful eyes seemed to pulse with unseen energy, the boundary between safety and chaos thinning. A gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine, earth, and something ancient. Hope or warning, Sarah couldn't tell. But one thing was certain: the road ahead was no longer a stretch of asphalt frozen in time. It was a threshold crossed, a door opened, a reckoning begun, and Sarah was ready to walk through it. The dim glow of the dashboard was the only light anchoring Sarah in the choking darkness. Outside, the wolves' eyes flickered, silent sentinels blinking in the cold night, neither advancing nor retreating, just watching. The forest beyond the highway seemed to hold its breath, the trees motionless, their skeletal branches clawing at a sky that had lost all color, swallowed by a suffocating gray. Inside the car, the air had thickened, heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of choices made. Sarah's hands hovered over the steering wheel, fingers trembling but unwilling to release their grip. Jamie sat beside her, his small frame rigid, eyes fixed on the window where shadows and shapes blurred together like a half-remembered nightmare. Neither spoke. Words had become brittle, sharp fragments impossible to piece together without cutting deeper. The silence stretched, a taut wire stretched thin between two uncertain points. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, filling every crevice with its oppressive stillness. Sarah's breath came slow, deliberate, a fragile rebellion against the rising panic clawing up her throat. She could feel Jamie's heartbeat sync with hers, a timid drumbeat echoing in the cramped space, both a comfort and a reminder of their shared vulnerability. Outside, a distant rustle cracked through the stillness. The wolves shifted ever so slightly, a ripple passing through the pack like a whispered warning. The sound was swallowed immediately, as if the night itself was swallowing breath to avoid disturbing the fragile standoff. Sarah's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching the endless line of cars behind them, frozen statues of fear and uncertainty, each driver trapped in their own suspended moment. The researcher's presence lingered at the window, a shadow among shadows. His eyes met Sarah's through the glass, a silent exchange passing between them, a mixture of warning, apology, and something unspoken that neither dared voice. He raised a finger to his lips, a gesture heavy with meaning. Wait, not yet, not now. Jamie's restless fingers gripped the wolf toy again, his knuckles white. The small plush had become a talisman, a fragile symbol of innocence clinging to the edge of this unraveling world. Sarah glanced at him, his eyes brimming with hope and dread tangled together, searching for answers she could no longer give. The heater's hum had faded to a ghostly whisper, replaced by the subtle, almost imperceptible pulse of the night, the distant snap of a twig, the soft scrape of fur against bark, the quiet breathing of the forest itself. Time had lost its shape. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into an endless loop of suspended tension. The road was no longer a path forward but a boundary, a thin membrane separating safety from chaos. Sarah's mind raced, yet the words she sought remained elusive. How long could they remain prisoners of this fragile limbo? How long before fear erupted into violence, before the wolves' patience shattered or the poachers made their move? Every instinct screamed to flee, to break the fragile peace, but every rational thought warned of the peril outside the fragile metal shell. Her eyes darted to the locked doors and the sealed windows, a fortress against the unknown. Yet the barrier felt thin, almost illusory. The wolves were out there, yes, but so were the shadows lurking beyond the trees, ghosts of human greed and desperation. The highway was a cage, and their sanctuary was only as strong as the fragile truce holding the night at bay. Jamie's voice broke the silence, barely a whisper, but heavy with unspoken terror. "Mum, what if they don't let us go?" Sarah swallowed hard, the lump in her throat thick enough to choke on. She wanted to answer, to promise safety, to deny the nightmare looming just beyond the glass. But all she could do was shake her head slowly, the motion heavy with the weight of the unknown. "I don't know," she breathed. "But we'll face whatever comes by and together." Outside, the wolves shifted again, their eyes reflecting a storm of emotions, fear, confusion, defiance. The forest seemed to lean closer, the cold pressing in like a living thing. The night held them all in a breathless pause, a fragile moment trembling on the edge of collapse. And in that silence, Sarah felt the last threads of certainty unraveling. The waiting was no longer just a pause. It was the quiet before the storm, the calm before the breaking. The moment where everything still hung in balance, fragile, electric, and unbearably close to shattering. The car jolted violently as a sudden impact rocked its side, a sharp, unforgiving slam that sent Sarah's head snapping against the headrest. Her breath hitched, caught between panic and pain, as the world outside erupted into chaos. The wolves howled in a frenzy, their cries tearing through the night like shattered glass. Shadows moved, figures pressing against the windows, faces twisted in desperation and menace. The poachers had come, and the fragile barrier between safety and destruction shattered in an instant. Jamie screamed, a raw sound ripped from the depths of his small body, and Sarah caught him before he could slip from her grasp. Her hands shook uncontrollably, gripping his trembling frame as tears blurred her vision. "It's okay, Jamie. I'm here." "I'm right here," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of fear and fury. But beneath her protectiveness, something else stirred. A deep, searing rage that refused to be silenced. The veneer of calm she'd struggled to maintain crumbled, replaced by a storm of emotions she had long buried. Anger for the wolves trapped in pain and sickness, anger for the forest sliced open by greed, and anger for the lies she'd told herself about control, safety, and her own strength. Sarah's gaze snapped to the researcher standing just beyond the passenger window, his face pale and grim in the flickering headlights. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" she demanded, voice raw and trembling. "About the traps, the sickness, the poachers. You knew this was coming." He flinched, eyes darkening with a haunted weight. "I wanted to protect you from all of it. I thought if I could manage the situation quietly, fewer people would get hurt." "Protect me," Sarah spat, a bitter laugh escaping. "You kept me in the dark while the forest bled and those wolves died a little more every day. You pretended to be their savior, but you were just a witness to their destruction." The researcher's shoulders sagged, a man breaking beneath the crushing truth. "I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to stop it." "No," Sarah said, voice rising until it cracked like thunder. "You chose silence. You chose to watch while everything fell apart. And now we're trapped here, caught between your secrets and the wolves' fury," Jamie whimpered, pressing into her side as the car shook again from another blow. Sarah's breath hitched, a sob caught in her throat. The photo she'd pulled from the glove compartment slipped from her trembling hands, fluttering to the floor. She didn't reach for it. It was a relic of a past she couldn't reclaim, a symbol of fractured families and broken promises. Her chest heaved with ragged breaths as the wall she'd built around herself crumbled. The mother who had tried to shield her son from pain was unraveling, raw and exposed. "I'm so tired," she confessed, voice barely more than a whisper. "Tired of pretending I'm strong when I'm not. Tired of fighting battles I didn't choose." Jamie's small hand found hers again, a fragile lifeline in the storm. "Mom, it's okay to be scared." "No," Sarah shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "It's not okay, not anymore. Because if I'm scared, what does that make you?" Silence filled the car, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant growls and the pounding at the windows. Then, with a sudden, shattering clarity, Sarah saw it, the unbearable truth she'd avoided. She could no longer protect Jamie from this broken world. She was part of it. The wilderness, the sickness, the poachers, the secrets, they were all tangled in her life, inescapable and raw. Her gaze hardened, fierce and unyielding. "We can't run from this," she said, voice steady despite the tremble beneath. "We have to face it, all of it, together." The wolves' howls seemed to answer her, a mournful chorus weaving through the night, and for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of their shared fight, not just for survival, but for something deeper, reckoning, truth, and the fragile hope of redemption. Outside, the darkness pressed in, relentless and unyielding. Inside, Sarah and Jamie clung to each other, their world forever changed. The road back was gone. The reckoning had begun. The highway was no longer just a stretch of asphalt beneath a heavy grey sky. It had become a line etched deep into Sarah's memory, a boundary between what was and what could never be again. The silence that followed the storm was thick, almost tangible, a quietness that seemed to hold its breath alongside her. The wolves had dispersed, the poachers gone, but the echoes of that day lingered like shadows cast long by a fading light. Sarah sat alone now, the car emptied and still, parked at the edge of the forest where the trees whispered gently in the evening breeze. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, its worn leather cool beneath her fingers, an anchor to the past and a reminder of the journey she'd endured. The wolf toy, once clutched tight by Jamie, lay quietly on the passenger seat, its soft fur dulled but comforting. It was more than a child's plaything now. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the fragile strength found in small things. As dusk settled, the sky softened, bruised hues giving way to stars timidly emerging through thinning clouds. The cold air carried the scent of pine and earth, the forest's breath mingling with the quiet ache inside her. She thought back to that morning, to the tension that pressed on her chest like a weight she could barely bear, the stillness before everything changed. The howls that had once filled her with fear now echoed differently in her mind, as mournful songs of survival and warning, voices of a world caught between harm and hope. The fractures in her life, once sharp and jagged like broken glass, felt less like wounds now and more like the spaces where light could enter. The divorce, the loneliness, the relentless struggle to hold her small family together. All had carved their marks, but they had also shaped her. She had learned that strength was not the absence of fear, but its companion, the quiet courage to face what cannot be controlled. Jamie's question from hours ago lingered softly. "Mom, do you think they know we're scared?" She smiled faintly, the memory warming her chest. Perhaps they did. Perhaps fear was a language shared across worlds, a bond linking human and wild alike. And maybe, beneath that fear, there was an unspoken plea for understanding, a fragile hope that the world might one day listen. Sarah reached into her glove compartment and lifted the faded photograph she had touched so many times before. The faces of her parents, young and hopeful beneath autumn leaves, looked back at her with a tenderness that transcended years. Where once the image had been a symbol of distance, now it felt like a bridge, connecting past and present, pain and possibility. She whispered into the quiet night, "We're still here, still standing, still waiting." The words were not a promise of easy answers, but a vow to carry forward, to bear witness to the delicate balance between loss and healing. The forest seemed to answer, a gentle rustle in the branches, a soft exhale of wind that carried both sorrow and grace. The wolves' eyes, once glowing with confusion and fear, had become memories etched in the dark, a reminder that survival was not just about endurance, but about change. Sarah turned the key, the engine's hum steady and sure. As the car rolled slowly onto the highway, she knew the road ahead was uncertain, shadowed by the scars of what had been, but she also knew she was not the same woman who had arrived at dawn. She carried within her the quiet strength of those who have faced the wild and found themselves transformed. Now, dear viewer, this story rests with you. What would you have done in Sarah's place? How do we honor the fragile bonds between human and nature, fear and hope, survival and surrender? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe for more journeys into the heart of the human experience. Together, let's listen to the stories the world is trying to tell us before the silence becomes too deep to break.